No one ever looked her in the eye. Frida May was just the janitor, a quiet shadow who polished marble while millionaires made decisions that would never include her. But that night, everything changed. When the billionaire's teenage son stood before the cameras at the charity gala and pointed to the back of the ballroom, the air turned electric. "If I can stand here he said, his voice breaking, "it's because that woman saved me." And in that moment, in front of everyone, Frida was finally seen. What no one knew was how she'd earned that boy's trust. In secret, in silence, while the rest of the world looked away, she had become his anchor, the only person who saw him drowning. The grand ballroom of the Regency Hotel looked like something out of a dream. Golden lights cascaded from crystal chandeliers, casting warm glows across polished marble floors that reflected every movement like water. Long silk banners embroidered with the Tyson Foundation logo hung from ceiling to floor, swaying gently in the air-conditioned breeze. Round tables draped in ivory linen surrounded the room, each centerpiece a towering arrangement of white orchids and gold-dusted leaves. A string quartet played softly near the entrance, their music floating beneath the hum of cultured conversation. Outside, valets in crisp uniforms guided luxury sedans and sleek sports cars into position. Doors opened to reveal CEOs in custom-tailored tuxedos, investors in silk gowns that shimmered under the entrance lights, politicians shaking hands and smiling for photographers stationed along the red carpet. It was the Tyson Foundation's annual charity gala, broadcast live, attended by the city's most powerful, designed to project wealth, influence, and flawless public image. At the far edge of the ballroom near the service corridor behind a velvet curtain, Frida May knelt beside her yellow mop bucket. Her red janitor uniform, faded from years of washing, sleeves rolled to her elbows, stood out like a warning sign against all the elegance. The knees of her pants were damp with cleaning solution. Her gloved hands, marked by decades of bleach and hard water, gripped the mop handle as she worked a stubborn scuff mark from the floor. She moved carefully, methodically, making sure not a single streak remained. She was 72 years old with deep-set eyes that had seen more than most people in that room could imagine. Her graying hair was pulled back into a tight bun beneath a simple hairnet. Her face carried the kind of dignity that no uniform could diminish, the quiet strength of someone who had survived by becoming invisible. "Frida, when you're finished, please use the back exit," said the event coordinator, a young woman in a headset and sleek black dress. She didn't make eye contact. "We have VIP guests arriving, and we'd like to keep the main spaces clear of service activity." Frida nodded without a word. She was used to this. 24 years of cleaning Tyson properties, first the old office building downtown, then the glass and steel tower that replaced it. Now these charity events held in ballrooms she could never afford to attend as a guest. She had scrubbed their floors, emptied their trash, polished their awards cases. And not once, not in nearly a quarter century, had anyone asked her name unless they needed something cleaned. With the floors gleaming, Frida wheeled her cart toward a small service closet tucked behind the stage. It smelled like industrial disinfectant and old mop water. She sat down on a plastic folding chair, pulled a small thermos from her bag, and unscrewed the lid carefully. The scent of rice and curry chicken, still warm, filled the cramped space. Through a narrow window in the door, she could see the ballroom filling up. She recognized one man immediately. Brian Tyson, tall, confident, silver at the temples, wearing a tuxedo that probably cost more than her monthly rent. He moved through the crowd like he owned the air itself, shaking hands, laughing too loudly, commanding attention without even trying. Beside him was his son, James, a boy no older than 14 or 15, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit with a crisp white shirt and pocket square. His hair was slicked back, his posture straight. To anyone watching, he looked like the picture of privilege and poise. But Frida saw something else. She saw the way his hands fidgeted at his sides, the way his jaw tightened when someone spoke to him, the way his eyes darted toward the stage like he was counting down to something terrible. She took a slow sip of her tea and lowered her gaze. She had promised herself she wouldn't get emotional tonight. No sadness, no bitterness, no longing for recognition. She would finish her shift, slip out the back like always, and go home to her one-bedroom apartment where no one expected her to be anything but herself. But something about tonight felt different. A tightness in her chest she couldn't name, a sense that the carefully constructed walls between her world and theirs were about to crack. She just didn't know how. Not yet. Brian Tyson stood at the center of a circle of admirers, a glass of champagne in hand, his laugh echoing across the marble floor. He was in his element, cameras flashing, reporters scribbling notes, fellow billionaires nodding in approval as he spoke about mental resilience, leadership legacy, and investing in the next generation. He had no idea that his son was barely holding it together. James stood a few feet away, flanked by two PR handlers and a speech coach who kept whispering reminders into his ear. His prepared speech, carefully written, meticulously edited, approved by 3 different teams, sat folded in his jacket pocket. He was supposed to walk up to that stage in 20 minutes, smile for the cameras, deliver inspirational lines about courage and opportunity, and make his father proud. But all he could think about was the woman in the red uniform, the one sitting alone in the closet behind the stage, the one who had saved him when no one else even knew he needed saving. His hands began to tremble. His breathing quickened. The old panic started to rise. A tightness in his chest, a buzzing in his ears. The terrible feeling that he was about to collapse in front of everyone. Then, across the crowded ballroom, through a gap in the velvet curtain, he saw her, Frida, still there, watching quietly. Their eyes met for just a second. She pressed 2 fingers to her chest and slowly breathed in and out. Their signal. The one she'd taught him months ago in a storage room when he thought his life was ending. James inhaled deeply, held it, let it out. His heart rate slowed, the panic receded, but something else took its place. A decision, a choice he'd been too afraid to make until this very moment. He couldn't do this anymore. He couldn't stand on that stage and pretend. He couldn't let the world believe he'd done this on his own. He couldn't let Frida stay invisible one more second. The MC's voice boomed across the ballroom. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. In just a few moments, we'll hear from a very special young man, James Tyson, son of our host and founder, who will share his thoughts on courage, leadership, and the future. Applause rippled through the crowd. Brian beamed with pride. The camera swiveled toward the stage, and James, his heart pounding but his breathing steady, looked one more time at the elderly Jamaican woman in the faded red uniform. The woman the world had ignored for 24 years. The woman who had taught him how to survive. Tonight he would make sure everyone knew her name, even if it meant breaking every rule his father had ever taught him. Frida set down her thermos and leaned back against the cold concrete wall. The sounds of the gala, clinking glasses, polite laughter, the rustle of expensive fabric, felt distant now, muffled. Her mind began to drift, pulled backward through time, toward a different hallway, a different kind of silence. It had started months ago, on an ordinary night, when she'd heard a sound that didn't belong. The sharp clink of a fork against crystal echoed across the ballroom, and suddenly Frida was somewhere else entirely. 6 months earlier, the 48th floor of Tyson Corporate Tower was silent, in that specific way expensive buildings get after hours. Carpeted hallways swallowing sound, fluorescent lights humming softly overhead. The distant whir of air conditioning, the only proof the place was still alive. Frida pushed her cleaning cart past the executive boardroom, rubber wheels squeaking faintly against polished tile. It had been a long day. The investor presentation had run late, and the boardroom looked like a hurricane of ambition had torn through it. Abandoned coffee cups, crumpled napkins, scattered printouts with charts and projections she'd never understand. She'd already emptied 3 trash bins and was working on wiping down the long mahogany table when she heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Frida stopped, one hand still on the table's edge, and tilted her head. There it was again, a strangled, choking noise coming from somewhere down the hall, like someone trying very hard not to cry. She followed the sound to a storage room door left slightly ajar. Yellow light spilled through the crack. Frida hesitated, her fingers hovering over the handle. She knew better than to insert herself into other people's business. especially up here where every person wore a suit that cost more than her monthly rent. But the sound came again, gasping, desperate. She pushed the door open. James Tyson sat on the floor, his back pressed against a tower of file boxes, knees pulled to his chest. His white dress shirt was rumpled, tie loosened and hanging crooked. A sleek black tablet lay face down beside him, its screen still glowing. His hands were shaking violently, and his breathing came in short, panicked bursts like his lungs had forgotten how to work. He looked up, eyes wide with terror and shame. I'm fine, he stammered, voice cracking. He scrambled to straighten his posture, wiping his eyes quickly with the back of his hand. You don't need to be here. I'm fine. Just leave. But Frida could see he was anything but fine. She'd raised 3 children of her own back in Jamaica, watched them through fevers and nightmares and heartbreaks. She knew panic when she saw it. Without a word, she stepped fully into the room and closed the door behind her. The boy flinched, looking trapped. Tech time. Cho, Frida said softly, her Jamaican lilt warming the sterile air. She lowered herself to sit cross-legged on the floor across from him, her old knees protesting, but her voice steady. Breathe with me. Just breathe. James shook his head, gasping. I can't breathe. Yes, you can, Frida said firmly but gently. She pressed one hand to her own chest and inhaled deeply through her nose, loud enough for him to hear. She held it, 1, 2, 3, then released it slowly through her mouth. Watch me. Into the nose. She did it again and again. James stared at her, his chest heaving, but after a moment he tried to mimic her rhythm. His first attempt was shaky, breaking halfway through. But Frida kept going, patient as stone, counting softly under her breath in patois. 1, 2, 3, hold it. Now let go. Slowly, painfully slowly, his breathing began to match hers. The shaking in his hands eased. The wild panic in his eyes dimmed to something closer to exhaustion. He blinked at her, stunned. How did you? Me grandmother teach me, Frida said simply. Back home in Jamaica. When my was afraid of tings, she show me this. Fear make the body tight. Breath make it soft again. James let out a long, shuddering exhale and leaned his head back against the boxes. I have to give a presentation tomorrow, he whispered, to the board. My dad expects. He wants me to be perfect. But every time I think about standing up there, his voice cracked. I can't breathe. Frida nodded slowly. She didn't tell him it would be easy. She didn't promise the fear would disappear. Instead, she said, fear natural, you know. Everybody have it. Courage not about no feeling fear. Courage about walking through it anyway. James looked at her like she'd just handed him something precious. They sat in silence for a moment, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Then Frida leaned forward and spoke with quiet conviction. Say this with me. Me still here. Panic no kill me. He hesitated, then repeated it softly. I'm still here. Panic didn't kill me. Again, Frida urged. I'm still here. Panic didn't kill me. This time his voice was stronger. James laughed, a short, surprised sound that seemed to catch even him off guard. It wasn't joy exactly, but it was something close to relief. Frida stood, brushing dust from her uniform, and offered him a small, knowing smile. She turned to leave, her hand on the door handle, when his voice stopped her. Wait, he said, what's your name? She looked back at him, this boy who'd been invisible to her the same way she'd been invisible to him until tonight. Frida, she said quietly. Frida May. He nodded, committing it to memory. Thank you, Frida. She didn't say you're welcome. She just gave him one more nod and slipped back into the hallway, closing the door softly behind her. But as she returned to her cart in the half-cleaned boardroom, Frida felt something shift, something small and fragile, something that felt against all odds like the beginning of something new. James Tyson was 14 years old and already drowning. On paper, his life looked flawless. Private tutors who praised his sharp mind, a tailor who came to the penthouse to fit his school uniforms, Reporters who cornered him at charity events, microphones thrust in his face. What kind of CEO do you want to be someday, James? He'd learned to smile on command, to tilt his head just right for cameras, to answer with polished lines his father had rehearsed with him. But inside, his heart was always racing. The stage fright had started years ago, third grade, maybe fourth, a simple book report in front of 20 kids. He'd frozen mid-sentence, his throat closing like someone had their hands around it, his vision tunneling until all he could see were their staring faces. The teacher had gently asked if he was all right. He'd mumbled something and sat down, cheeks burning with shame. It never got better. Only worse. He avoided presentations, faked sick on speech days, let group partners do the talking. He learned to smile while his hands shook under the table, to nod along while his heart hammered so loud he was sure everyone could hear it. His father called it nerves. His tutors called it shyness. Nobody called it what it was, terror. Until Frida. After that night in the storage room, James started finding excuses to stop by his father's office, just checking if Dad left his briefcase, picking up some papers he asked for, saying hi before heading home. Really, he was looking for her. And Frida, pushing her cart down hallways that smelled like lemon cleaner and carpet shampoo, always seemed to know. She'd glance up from wiping down a water fountain or emptying a trash bin, catch his eye, and give the smallest nod toward an empty conference room or a side corridor where the cameras didn't quite reach. A pattern formed. Before a small speech at school, just 2 minutes introducing a guest speaker, James found her polishing the glass doors near the executive elevator. She set down her spray bottle and guided him to a quiet corner. "Breathe first," she said simply. "Always breathe first." But it wasn't just breathing anymore. Frida had started inventing little tricks, small rituals that somehow made the impossible feel survivable. "You know what fear is?" she asked him once, leaning against a janitor's closet door while he practiced standing still. "Fear like a loud radio in your head. All noise, all the time. But you can turn it down, not off, just down. Listen to the quiet under the noise." He didn't fully understand, but he tried. And somehow when he stood at the podium that afternoon, the roaring in his head was quieter. Another time, before a school debate he couldn't avoid, she made him stand barefoot on the cold tile floor of an empty break room. "Feel you toes," she instructed, pressing her own feet flat. "Grip the floor like tree roots. You not floatin', you planted. Nobody can blow you down." He'd felt ridiculous. But when his turn came to speak, he pressed his feet into his shoes and imagined roots growing through the soles. His voice didn't shake as much. Before a company tour where he had to introduce himself to a group of international investors, Frida taught him to shake out his hands, hard, like he was flinging water off his fingers. "Nerves mean you care," she said, shaking her own weathered hands beside him in a storage hallway. "Not that you weak. Strong people still get nervous. They just don't let it stop them." James repeated it to himself like a mantra as he walked into that room full of strangers. "Nerves mean I care, not that I'm weak." He survived. Slowly, in fragments stolen between her shifts and his obligations, James began to open up. He told her about the pressure, how his father expected him to be Tyson 2.0, a perfect replica with none of the flaws, how every small failure felt like proof he'd never measure up, how sometimes he wished he could just be a regular kid without a legacy waiting to crush him. Frida listened without judgment, her hands never stopping their work, folding towels, organizing supplies, wiping down surfaces. And then she told him her own stories, about leaving Jamaica in her 40s with 3 children and 2 suitcases, about standing in front of immigration officers who spoke too fast and looked at her like she didn't deserve to breathe their air, about working 3 jobs, cleaning offices at night, caring for other people's children during the day, and taking in laundry on weekends, just to keep her family fed. "You think me wasn't scared?" she asked him once, her voice soft but steady. "Me was terrified every single day, but fear don't pay rent, so my walk through it anyway." James stared at her, realizing something that made his chest ache. This woman had conquered fears that made his stage fright look like a paper cut. Quietly, without fanfare, he started doing better. A class presentation on the American Revolution. He stumbled twice but finished. A school debate about environmental policy. His hands shook, but his voice held. A short introduction at a corporate tour. He forgot his planned joke but smiled through it anyway. Each time it was Frida's techniques that saved him, not the expensive speech coaches his father hired, not the meditation apps his tutor recommended, just a janitor's grandmother's breathing exercises and her steady, unshakable belief that he could do this. Guilt started gnawing at him. "People should know what you've done for me," he said one evening, watching her mop a conference room floor after a late meeting. Frida shook her head, not even looking up. "No need feed 'em, no. As long as you can breathe, this enough." "But it's not fair. Life not fair, Chile," she said gently. "But it's still good." The email arrived on a Tuesday. James was in his room doing homework when his father knocked and entered without waiting for permission. "Good news," Brian announced, grinning. "The foundation gala is in 6 weeks. I've signed you up to give the keynote speech. It'll be televised, live streamed to thousands. This is your moment, son." James's stomach dropped. His father kept talking, something about PR teams and rehearsals and making the Tyson name proud. But James couldn't hear him over the sudden roaring in his ears. Televised. Thousands of people. Cameras. His father's expectations pressed down like a physical weight. The moment Brian left, closing the door behind him with a satisfied click, the panic hit. James's hands started shaking. His breathing quickened. The old, familiar terror wrapped around his throat like a fist. He grabbed his phone with trembling fingers and typed out a single message to the number he'd quietly saved months ago. "I need help." 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Then, "Meet me at the tower, 48th floor, me be there." James exhaled shakily and closed his eyes. He knew only one person who could save him now. Brian Tyson believed in 3 things: strategy, execution, and legacy. The conference room on the 52nd floor gleamed under recessed lighting, every surface polished to a mirror shine. 8 people sat around the black glass table: PR directors, board members, a media consultant flown in from New York, all waiting for Brian to approve the final plan for the Tyson Foundation Gala. "Let's be clear about what we're doing here," Brian said, leaning back in his leather chair with the confidence of a man who'd built an empire from ambition and calculated risk. "This isn't just another charity event. This is about repositioning Tyson Corp as human-centered. Mental resilience, community investment, youth empowerment, those are the pillars." The PR director nodded, clicking through slides on the wall-mounted screen. "Exactly. We've seen the research. Companies that prioritize mental health and wellness see measurable increases in brand loyalty and public trust. This gala puts us at the forefront of that conversation." "And the keynote?" Brian asked. "We think James should deliver it," the media consultant said smoothly. She wore frameless glasses and spoke like every word had been focus grouped. "A young voice talking about courage and leadership projects the perfect family legacy image. It humanizes the brand, shows continuity, values passed down." Brian smiled, pride swelling in his chest. "James will be perfect. He's got the composure for it. Natural presence." No one questioned it. Why would they? Brian Tyson's son had every advantage. The best schools, the best tutors, the best opportunities money could buy. The meeting adjourned with handshakes and timelines. Brian felt satisfied, in control. Another challenge, another victory in the making. At home that evening, Brian found James in the living room trying on the new suit the tailor had delivered. "Look at you," Brian said, grinning as he loosened his own tie. "That fits perfectly. You're going to look like $1,000,000 up there." James stood stiffly in front of the floor-length mirror, his reflection pale and uncertain. "Dad, The Navy's a good choice," Brian continued, talking over him without realizing it. "Professional but approachable. The cameras will love it. We've got the speech coach coming by twice a week, and PR is drafting your remarks. All you have to do is show up and be yourself." "But what if I'm not ready?" James's voice was quiet, almost a whisper. Brian laughed, clapping his son on the shoulder. Everyone gets nervous, son. Even me. Winners push through. That's what separates people like us from everyone else. James said nothing. He just stared at his reflection like he was looking at a stranger. Brian assumed it was humility, maybe even maturity. His boy was growing up. 2 weeks before the gala, Brian sat in on a session with the speech coach, a woman named Dr. Marianne Chen, who charged $300 an hour and spoke in carefully modulated tones designed to project confidence. We want to emphasize transformation, Dr. Chen explained, pacing the study where James sat with a draft speech on his lap. From challenge to triumph. The audience needs to feel inspired, uplifted. Avoid anything too heavy or uncertain. Brian nodded from his seat by the window, scrolling through emails on his phone. Make it memorable. Something people will quote. Dr. Chen smiled professionally. Absolutely. James, try the opening again, and this time really project. Think about filling the room with your voice. James took a breath and started reading. His voice wavered slightly on the second sentence. Louder, Dr. Chen instructed, and slower. You're rushing. Brian glanced up briefly, then returned to his screen. He trusted Dr. Chen to handle the technicalities. His job was to provide the opportunity. James's job was to seize it. It never occurred to him to ask how his son actually felt. Brian believed, genuinely believed, that he was doing everything a successful father should do. He was giving James exposure, platform, mentorship. He was opening doors that most kids could never dream of walking through. He was preparing his son to inherit not just wealth, but purpose. What more could a father offer? He never imagined that James was quietly falling apart. That late at night, his son sat on the edge of his bed with shaking hands, staring at a script he couldn't bring himself to read aloud. That the polished exterior Brian praised so often was held together by sheer desperation and the secret help of a janitor his father barely noticed. One evening, Brian walked through the lobby of Tyson Tower after a late meeting, phone pressed to his ear as he laughed with a board member about projected earnings. Frida May knelt near the entrance, polishing the marble floor with slow, careful strokes. Her red uniform blended into the background, just another part of the building's maintenance. Brian walked past her without breaking stride. He didn't glance at her name tag, didn't acknowledge her presence. Yeah, James is doing great, Brian said into the phone, his voice echoing across the empty lobby. Kid's a natural on stage. Takes after his old man, I guess. Frida paused mid-stroke, listening. She said nothing, just pressed her rag against the floor and kept working. To Brian, she was simply part of the infrastructure. Someone he took care of through paychecks and employee benefits. He probably couldn't have told you her name if asked. She was a fixture, like the lobby furniture or the security desk. Invisible, insignificant, wrong. 3 days before the gala, Brian sat in his office reviewing the final draft of James's speech. PR had polished it to perfection. Every word carefully chosen, every pause strategically placed. It was inspirational without being preachy, personal without being vulnerable. Exactly what the moment called for. He signed off with a satisfied nod and forwarded it to the teleprompter team. This is going to be perfect, he said aloud to the empty room. He had no idea that his son had no intention of reading those words, that James had already made a decision that would shatter every carefully constructed plan, that the woman Brian walked past without a second glance had become the single most important person in his son's life. Brian Tyson had built an empire on vision and control, but he was about to learn that some things, some truths, cannot be controlled, not even by a billionaire. Frida was mopping the back corridor near the supply closet when James came rushing down the hallway, his face pale as paper. Frida! His voice cracked. He looked like he'd been running, or maybe crying, or both. I need to talk to you. She set down her mop, concern tightening in her chest. What happened, child? The gala, he said, breath coming fast. It's not just some small event. Dad told me there's going to be live streaming, press cameras everywhere, hundreds of people, politicians, CEOs, everyone who matters in this city. And I'm supposed to stand up there and give this perfect speech about courage and leadership. His hands were shaking. I can't do it, Frida. I thought about pretending to be sick, just not showing up. Frida studied him for a long moment, her weathered hands resting on her hips. Then she spoke, her voice gentle but firm. You want run from this fear all you life? Or you want show it who boss? James blinked, caught off guard. Come, Frida said, gesturing toward the empty hallway that stretched before them. We go and train harder. She made him stand at one end of the corridor while she positioned herself at the other. Then she picked up two mop handles and began banging them together. Loud, jarring clangs that echoed off the walls. Now talk, she called over the noise. Pretend me a crowd. Pretend all them cameras on you. James stared at her. What? Talk, she insisted, banging louder. He opened his mouth, tried to project his voice over the clattering. My name is... The sound drowned him out. Louder, Frida commanded. My name is James Tyson. His voice cracked. Again. He tried again, and again. His throat hurt from the effort, but gradually his voice began to cut through the noise. By the 10th attempt, he was shouting, his words clear and strong despite the chaos. Frida lowered the mop handles, breathing hard. Good. When the real noise come, the cameras, the people, you voice already know how fight through it. Next, she made him walk the length of the hallway as though it were a stage. Head up, she instructed, walking beside him. Look straight ahead. Don't rush. Stage not going nowhere. James walked, stumbled on nothing, caught himself. Again, Frida said patiently. He walked again. Shoulders squared this time, steps more deliberate. That's it, she murmured. You not running to the podium, you owning the space. They practiced until his legs ached and his breathing was steady. Then Frida stood before him, her eyes soft but serious. Repeat after me, she said. Me nu hafi be perfect. I don't have to be perfect, James said quietly. Me hus hafi be brave. I just have to be brave. Again, until you believe it. They repeated it together over and over until the words stopped feeling like a wish and started feeling like a truth. Afterward, they sat on the floor with their backs against the wall, both exhausted. How did you learn all this? James asked, his voice hoarse. The breathing, the tricks. Where did it come from? Frida was quiet for a moment, staring at the scuffed tiles beneath her feet. Then she began to speak. Me leave Jamaica when me was 42, she said softly. 3 children, 2 suitcase and a plane ticket me saved for 2 year to buy. Me come here with nothing. James listened, not daring to interrupt. Me work as nanny first, Frida continued. Den cleaner, den caregiver for old people who couldn't remember the own name. Everywhere ma go, people treat me like me invisible. Laugh at me accent. Talk slow like me, stupid. Ask me if he clean up messes my never make. Her voice didn't waver, but James could hear the weight of years in every word. One time, she said, me avi fi stand in front of immigration officer and explain why ma deserve fi stay. My hands shaking so bad ma drop my papers, but ma do the breathing. Count in, hold, let go. And my speak, ma tell them my story. Did it work? James asked. Frida smiled faintly. My still here, no? James swallowed hard. Why didn't you ever complain? Why did you stay here at this job being treated like you're invisible? Frida turned to look at him, her eyes steady and strong. Because my stubborn, she said simply. And because sometimes quiet people still change things. You don't always see it right away. But change happened. James was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice thick with emotion. If I get through this gala, I'm not keeping you a secret anymore. I'm going to tell people what you did for me. I mean it, Frida. Frida's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. She patted his hand. You just focus on breathing, Chile. Does all that matter? But inside, the idea terrified her. Being seen, being known, being thrust into light after a lifetime of shadows. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. She'd survived this long by staying small, by not making waves. What would happen if the world finally looked her way? James stood to leave, brushing dust from his pants. Thank you, he said, voice steady now, for everything. Go practice, Frida said gently. And remember, courage not perfect. It just real. She watched him walk down the hallway toward the elevator, his posture straighter than when he'd arrived. When the doors closed and she was alone again, Frida closed her eyes and whispered a prayer in patois, soft words her grandmother had taught her long ago. Lord, protect this boy. Give him strength. Let him voice be heard. And if it be you will, let him be brave enough I do what's right. She picked up her mop and returned to work, the corridor silent once more. But something had shifted, something fragile and powerful. And Frida knew, whether she was ready or not, that the shadows she'd hidden in for 24 years were about to crack wide open. The green room smelled like hairspray and expensive cologne. James sat rigid in a director's chair while a stylist adjusted his tie for the third time, her fingers nimble and impersonal. There, she said, stepping back to admire her work. Perfect. Perfect. That word again, the word that had haunted him his entire life. James, remember your cues, the stage manager said, clipboard in hand, headset crackling with backstage chatter. Walk to center stage, pause for applause, acknowledge your father in the front row, then begin. The teleprompter will be running, but you've got the cards as backup. Stick to the script, added the PR handler, a sharp-eyed woman in a sleek black dress who'd been hovering near him all evening. This is being live-streamed to thousands. Every word matters. Keep it inspirational. Keep it clean. And for God's sake, don't go off book. James nodded mechanically, but he wasn't listening. His thoughts were racing too fast, colliding into each other like cars in a pileup. Third grade, the book report, frozen at the front of the classroom. Seventh grade, the class debate, hands shaking so badly he dropped his note cards. Last year, the company tour, his father's proud smile and the suffocating pressure to be worthy of it. The weight of the Tyson name pressed down on his chest like a physical thing. Every camera out there would be focused on him. Every executive, politician, and investor would be watching to see if Brian Tyson's son was worth the legacy. One mistake, one stumble, one moment of panic caught on film, and he'd be labeled a disappointment for the rest of his life. His breathing quickened. His hands felt cold. 2 minutes, the stage manager announced. James stood on shaking legs and moved toward the stage wings. Through a gap in the velvet curtain, he could see the ballroom. Hundreds of faces turned expectantly toward the stage, cameras mounted on tripods, lights blazing. The Tyson Foundation banner hung behind the podium like a judgment. Then his eyes found her. Frida, at the far edge of the room, near the service corridor, kneeling beside a spill on the marble floor. Her red uniform was so bright against the sea of black tuxedos and evening gowns. She looked so small, so out of place, a woman the room had already forgotten existed. As if sensing his gaze, Frida looked up, their eyes locked across the distance. She straightened slightly, then tapped her chest twice with 2 fingers. Their signal. She inhaled deeply, visibly, then exhaled slowly. James copied her. In through the nose, hold, out through the mouth. His heart rate slowed. The panic receded just enough to let him think. But another emotion rose in its place, something hotter, sharper. Anger. Anger that she was still down there on her knees, still invisible, still treated like part of the furniture while everyone in this room celebrated their wealth and influence. She had saved him, literally saved his life, and no one here even knew her name. 30 seconds, the stage manager whispered urgently. James reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the note cards. Pristine white, neatly typed, every word approved by 3 different teams. The speech about courage, opportunity, and the future of leadership. Safe words, polished words, empty words. He stared at them, then slowly folded the cards in half, then in half again. He realized something with sudden, crystalline clarity. If he walked out there and repeated the PR-approved script, he'd still be letting fear control him. Not the fear of public speaking, he'd conquered that, but the fear of his father's disappointment, the fear of disrupting the perfect image, the fear of telling the truth. True courage wasn't about delivering a flawless performance. It was about standing in front of the world and being honest, even when honesty was terrifying. The MC's voice boomed across the ballroom. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage a young man who represents the future of leadership and compassion. James Tyson. Applause erupted. Loud, expectant, hungry. James stepped through the curtain. The lights were blinding, hot and white and impossibly bright. He couldn't see individual faces anymore, just shapes and shadows in the red recording lights of cameras. His throat felt dry as sandpaper, but his breathing stayed steady, in and out, slow and deliberate, the way Frida had taught him. He walked to the podium, not rushing, not stumbling, feet gripping the floor like tree roots, head up, shoulders back. The applause faded. The room fell into expectant silence. James gripped the edges of the podium and looked out at the crowd. Somewhere in the front row, his father sat beaming with pride. Somewhere behind him, the teleprompter began scrolling the approved script. Then James turned his head. He looked past the tuxedos and gowns, past the crystal glasses and golden centerpieces, all the way to the edge of the room where Frida stood frozen, her cleaning rag still in one hand, her eyes wide with concern. Their gazes met one final time. And in that moment, James made his choice. He would not give the speech they wrote. He would not pretend. He would not let the woman who saved him remain invisible for one more second. He opened his mouth, not to recite polished corporate words, but to tell the truth, no matter the cost. Frida stood frozen near the service corridor, her cleaning rag clutched in one hand, watching James at the podium. Please remember to breathe, she thought. Just breathe, Chile. He looked so small up there beneath the blazing lights, despite his tailored suit and carefully styled hair. The audience waited expectantly. Hundreds of faces turned toward him, cameras recording every second. This was the moment they trained for, practiced for, prayed for. James opened his mouth and spoke the scripted opening line. Tonight, I stand before you to talk about courage. Then he stopped. The silence stretched like pulled taffy, uncomfortable and too long. People shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. The teleprompter kept scrolling, but James wasn't looking at it. He was looking directly at Frida, her breath caught in her throat. I can't do this, James said into the microphone, his voice quiet but clear. I can't stand here and pretend. A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd. In the front row, Brian Tyson's proud smile began to falter. I want to talk about fear, James continued, his voice gaining strength. The real kind, not the kind you overcome in a motivational quote. I'm talking about the kind that makes your hands shake so badly you drop things. The kind that makes your lungs forget how to work. The kind that makes you want to disappear rather than stand in front of people. Gasps rippled through the ballroom. Executives exchanged glances. This wasn't the script. James raised his hand. Slowly, deliberately, he pointed across the room, straight at Frida. That woman right there, he said, his voice trembling but unwavering. If I can stand here today, it's because that woman saved me. Frida's eyes went wide. Horror washed over her as hundreds of heads turned to look. Cameras pivoted, zooming in on her red uniform, her weathered face, her name tag that read Frida May. She taught me how to breathe, James said, his words echoing through the stunned silence. She taught me how to be brave. No, Frida thought desperately. No, stop. She wanted to sink into the floor, to vanish to return to the comfortable invisibility she'd worn like armor for 24 years. But James didn't stop. 6 months ago, I had a panic attack in a storage room on the 48th floor of Tyson Tower, he said, his voice raw with honesty. I couldn't breathe. I thought I was dying. And Frida, the janitor everyone walks past without seeing, she found me. She sat with me. She taught me breathing exercise her grandmother taught her in Jamaica. The audience sat in stunned silence. Some executives looked offended, appalled that the carefully orchestrated event was being derailed. Others leaned forward, captivated. After that night, we kept meeting, James continued, in hallways, in storage rooms, in empty conference rooms. Before every presentation, every speech, every moment I thought would destroy me, Frida was there. She taught me to imagine fear as a radio I could turn down. She made me stand with my toes gripping the floor like tree roots. She told me that nerves don't mean you're weak, they mean you care. His voice cracked. No expensive speech coach helped me. No therapist or tutor or meditation app. Just a 72-year-old woman in a janitor's uniform who everyone ignores. She saved me, and I'm done pretending she doesn't exist. In the front row, Brian Tyson sat motionless. His face cycled through emotions too quickly to name. Shock, confusion, pride, shame. His son had been falling apart for months, and he'd had no idea. A janitor had known his child better than he did. The realization hit him like a punch to the chest. The ballroom remained silent, a heavy, breathless quiet that pressed down on everyone. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the room, one person began to clap. Slowly, hesitantly, others joined. The applause built like a wave, spreading row by row until nearly everyone was on their feet. Some wiped tears from their eyes. Others clapped so hard their hands turned red. Cameras continued rolling. The live stream chat exploded with comments. James gestured toward Frida, extending his hand. "Please," he said into the microphone, "come up here." The MC, standing off to the side, looked panicked. Security staff exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to intervene. This wasn't protocol. This wasn't planned. But the audience was clapping. Cameras were recording. And James stood waiting, his hand still extended toward the elderly Jamaican woman in the red uniform. Frida's heart hammered in her chest. Her legs felt like they might give out. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to hide, to return to the shadows where she belonged. But James was still looking at her, his eyes pleading, his courage on full display, the courage she'd helped him find. "You knew Hafi be perfect," she'd told him so many times. "You just Hafi be brave." Now it was her turn. Slowly, on trembling legs that had scrubbed floors and climbed stairs and carried the weight of decades of invisible labor, Frida took one hesitant step forward, then another. The applause grew louder, and for the first time in 24 years, Frida May walked through a room full of people who were actually seeing her. Frida's legs trembled with every step down the aisle. She was acutely, painfully aware of everything, the cameras swiveling to follow her movement, zooming in on her wrinkled hands and bleach-stained uniform, her name tag that said Frida May in faded block letters, the way her worn-out work shoes squeaked softly against the polished marble floor she'd cleaned just hours earlier. Hundreds of eyes watched her, wealthy, powerful people in designer clothes and expensive jewelry, all staring at the janitor who'd been invisible to them moments ago. She wanted to run, to disappear back into the service corridor where she belonged. But James stood waiting at the edge of the stage, his hand extended toward her. When she reached the stairs, he came down to meet her, gripping her hand gently. "It's okay," he whispered, guiding her up the steps. "I've got you." Her knees protested the climb, but she made it. The lights were even brighter up here, hot against her skin. The crowd seemed impossibly large. James led her to the microphone and spoke clearly. "This is Frida May. For 24 years, she has kept this company's floors shining. And for the last 6 months, she helped me learn to stand here tonight." Another wave of applause rolled through the ballroom, louder this time. It crashed over Frida like a physical force. Some people in the back, kitchen staff, service workers, people in uniforms like hers, began to cry. They recognized her, someone who'd always been there, finally being seen. Then, movement in the front row. Brian Tyson stood. Frida's breath caught. She watched the billionaire CEO rise from his seat and begin walking toward the stage. Each step felt like it took a lifetime. Her mind raced with fear. He's going to scold me. He's going to tell me I overstepped. He's going to fire me in front of everyone. But when Brian reached the stage and climbed the stairs, his face showed something Frida hadn't expected. Humility. He walked directly to her and extended his hand. Not to James, not to the cameras, to Frida. She hesitated, then placed her calloused, work-worn hand in his. They shook, a firm, respectful handshake, the kind reserved for equals. "Thank you," Brian said into the microphone, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for giving my son something money couldn't buy." The applause intensified. People rose to their feet again. Brian turned to address the crowd, though his words felt like they were aimed inward at himself. I never saw what my son was going through. I didn't notice his fear, and I never acknowledged the quiet contribution of someone who has been part of this company longer than most of us. It was a rare moment of public vulnerability from a man who'd built an empire on confidence and control, an admission that he'd failed to see what mattered most. Frida stood frozen, overwhelmed. The ceremony continued around them in a blur. Eventually, staff guided them backstage as the MC tried to restore some semblance of the planned program. The backstage corridor was narrow and plain, concrete walls, fluorescent lighting, none of the glamour of the ballroom. Frida leaned against a stack of supply crates, catching her breath. She heard footsteps and looked up to see Brian Tyson approaching. Alone this time. No cameras, no audience, no PR handlers whispering in his ear. He stopped a few feet away, hands in his pockets, looking uncertain. Ms. May, he began, then paused. Frida, I wanted to thank you again. Without the cameras. She nodded slowly. I should have known, Brian said quietly, his voice stripped of its usual confidence. I'm his father. I should have seen what he was going through. Frida studied him for a moment, then spoke gently but honestly. You son's strong, Mr. Tyson. Me only help him find it. The strength was always there. Brian's jaw tightened, emotion flickering across his face. Frida continued, her voice soft but firm. Next part of you. See him, listen him, not just the words him say, but the things him don't say too. The words hit Brian like a physical blow. This woman, this janitor he'd walked past countless times without a second glance, knew his son better than he did. She'd seen James's pain, his fear, his struggle. She'd sat with him in storage rooms and taught him how to breathe, while Brian had been too busy building an empire to notice his own child falling apart. The devastation of that realization settled over him like a heavy coat. I don't know how to thank you, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Start with seeing people, Frida said simply. Really seeing them. They stood in silence for a moment, billionaire and janitor, separated by wealth and power but united briefly by their shared love for the same boy. Brian nodded, then extended his hand again. This time, when they shook, it felt different. Not performative, not for show, just two people acknowledging a truth that had been hidden for too long. He left without another word, disappearing back toward the ballroom. Frida stood alone in the corridor, the sounds of the gala muffled and distant. She reached for her mop handle, her constant companion, the tool she'd used to stay invisible for so many years. Her heart was still racing, but this time it wasn't from being ignored. It was from being seen. For the first time in 24 years, Frida May had been truly, fully seen, her name spoken aloud, her story told, her hands shaken by a billionaire in front of hundreds of witnesses. It terrified her, and somehow, impossibly, it also felt like freedom. She leaned against her mop handle, closed her eyes, and whispered a prayer of gratitude into the quiet. Thank you, Lord. Thank you. The video went viral within hours. A grainy phone recording, someone in the ballroom audience had captured the moment James pointed at Frida and declared she'd saved him. The clip spread across social media like wildfire, racking up millions of views overnight. News outlets picked it up by morning. Headlines blazed across screens. Who is Frida May and the janitor who saved the billionaire's son? Think pieces followed. Commentators debated class, invisibility, mental health stigma, and the quiet heroism of service workers. Frida's face, weathered and kind in her red uniform, became a symbol. She still didn't quite understand what it all meant. 3 weeks later, Tyson Tower hummed with a different energy. The lobby had been transformed for a small ceremony. No cameras this time, no press, just employees, executives in suits standing alongside custodians in uniforms, administrative staff mingling with kitchen workers. A banner stretched across the atrium. Tyson Foundation Mental Health and Resilience Initiative. The new program was ambitious. Free counseling services for all employees and their families, with special emphasis on frontline and support staff who'd been overlooked for too long. Workshops on stress management, breathing techniques, emotional wellness, mental health days formally integrated into paid leave policies. It wasn't charity, it was recognition that everyone, from the CEO to the janitor, carry burdens that deserved attention. Frida stood near the entrance of a small workshop room, still in her familiar red uniform, but wearing a new badge pinned beside her name tag. It read, Peer Mentor. She welcomed people with a shy smile, guiding them toward chairs arranged in a circle. Come in, she said softly in her Jamaican lilt. No need for be nervous. We all just here if we learn how fi breathe better. Some employees looked skeptical. Others seemed desperate for help. But they came. And when Frida demonstrated the breathing exercises, counting in, holding, letting out, hands that had been clenched began to relax. James visited often, not with cameras or PR handlers, just himself, a notebook, and a genuine desire to learn. He sat in on workshops, shared his own story with peers struggling with anxiety, and listened more than he spoke. It doesn't go away completely, he told a young intern one afternoon, his voice steady and honest. The fear, the panic, but you learn to walk through it. Someone taught me that. The intern followed his gaze to where Frida stood adjusting chairs. An understanding flickered across her face. Brian had changed too, subtly in ways only those closest to him noticed. He asked more questions now, listened longer. In the evenings, instead of reviewing James's schedule or discussing future business strategies, they actually talked about fears, about pressure, about the weight of expectations and the courage it takes to admit you're struggling. Brian didn't have all the answers, but he was learning to be present. And that, James realized, was more valuable than any inheritance. The ceremony to unveil the photograph happened on a bright Tuesday morning. A small crowd gathered in the lobby as the silk covering was pulled away. The framed image showed James and Frida standing together on the gala stage, his hand extended towards her face caught in that moment between terror and hope. Below the photograph, engraved in elegant script, were 7 words. Courage comes from the most unexpected teachers. Applause rippled through the lobby. Some employees wiped their eyes. Others nodded as if finally understanding something they'd missed before. Over the following days and weeks, the photograph became part of the building's rhythm. Employees paused in front of it on their way to meetings. Some smiled. Some stood quietly, reflecting. A few, particularly those in uniforms like Frida's, lingered longer, perhaps feeling seen in a way they hadn't before. It became a silent challenge, a reminder to notice the invisible people, to look beyond titles and paychecks and see the humanity in everyone who walked these halls. Late one evening, when the lobby had emptied and the building settled into its nighttime quiet, Frida stood alone in front of the photograph. She shook her head slowly, still unable to quite believe it. That was her face, her name, her story, preserved in glass and metal and engraved words. She reached out and touched the frame lightly with one fingertip. Then she turned back to her cleaning cart, parked a few feet away. The mop bucket, the spray bottles, the worn rags, all still there. Her work unchanged, but something else had shifted. As she pushed the cart toward the service elevator, a late-working executive hurried past. He paused mid-stride, turned back, and made eye contact. "Good night, Frida," he said, his voice respectful. "Thank you for everything you do." She blinked, surprised. "Good night," she replied softly. He walked on, and Frida continued toward the elevator, but a small smile tugged at her lips. The next morning it happened again. A young analyst held the door for her and asked how her weekend had been. At lunch, a manager stopped to thank her for cleaning up a conference room mess. People still walked past her every day. But now they looked her in the eye. They said her name. They smiled. They saw her not as furniture, not as background, but as a person. Someone who mattered. Someone whose quiet presence had changed everything. Frida May had spent 24 years invisible. But invisibility, she was learning, was not permanent. Sometimes courage came from the most unexpected places. And sometimes, if you were patient and stubborn and kind enough to help one scared boy breathe, the world might finally turn around and see you, not as a janitor, but as a teacher, a mentor, a hero. And that legacy, that quiet, powerful legacy, would outlast any empire. If this story moved you, share the moment. Don't let it fade. Follow Motherland Stories and tap that like button to keep these voices alive. Every day we uncover strong stories, raw truths, and quiet acts of courage that shape our world. Join a circle of listeners, dreamers, and changemakers, because every story deserves to be heard. This wasn't just an episode, it was a call to remember. Silence hides injustice. Courage exposes it. At Motherland Stories, we don't turn away. We bear witness. Subscribe and stand with stories that challenge power and celebrate truth.